Hello everybody and welcome back to Power Wash Simulator 2! In this episode I'll be continuing the Star Wars DLC where I'll be cleaning the Millenium Falcon. This will probably be a big job. Probably. I don't really know what have you. Right, there is a hidden achievement in this. There's a what's called a hidden blaster on it. I've got to clean that. Right. Yee-haw, the Empire can keep building their Death Stars and we'll just keep knocking them out. The thing is, I promised Han that I'd return the Falcon without a scratch, but I snapped off the dish during the run-in, so I'd better return gleaming like the diamond mines of Arcania, which is where my favourite droid comes in. Right. Oh, I'm way up here. I did a clean-up job just over there somewhere with the X-Wing. Yeah, this is certainly a big job. Where's the hidden blaster? That's the normal quad laser. There was another. There was a hidden blaster, or what have you. In one of the episodes, I think it was episode 4. New Hope, I think it is, where everyone's introduced basically. When they were in the hangar bay, a blaster popped down from the bottom somewhere and started shooting the what do you call it? The Imperials. That's what I'm looking for. Is that it? Or is that just a damage? Oh, that's quite an echo. Quite an echo. Let's just clean up underneath. Yeah, there's damage under here. Han Solo. Hey Londo, caught your light show. That was 1 in a million. Where are you? More importantly, where's my Falcon? Lando Calrissian. Relax, Han, old buddy. Everything's in order. Crouch down for a better angle underneath. The 12% done. Ooh. Oh, message. You promised me not to scratch, remember? From Lando. I'm just getting P0 to run a jet over her before we fly down. Han Solo. You're getting her cleaned? Okay, now I'm worried. Is that it? Yep, that's it. What's that? How's this hidden blaster? 24% done. Itch. Get this done. Just had a thought, is the hidden blaster somewhere outside the or is it on top? I swear there was a port on the underside where it was. Get up on the roof, on the top, see maintenance bay, quad cannon, sensor dish, mount. Where is it? Huh. I'm sure it'll appear at some point. Ah. Oh. Do 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 Oh! I knew it! There we go! She's got it where it goes. I knew it was under a panel, I guess I just had to reveal the panel. Now I can just focus on cleaning. Oh, message. What have you done to my ship? Lando Calrissian. Han, calm down. Just got a bit cooked on the way out. I'll be down there real soon. Oh, and don't start the party without me. Han Solo. Without the person who saved the galaxy, no chance. Yeah, I'm making no sense when I'm singing. Yep, ow, 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 1 second, ow, ow. Ow, that hurt. Some reason my ear, right ear, decided that it's going to be very painful. Oh. It's not my headset pressing onto it, because my headset's big enough to wrap around me and what have you. The sort of thing goes, all of a sudden my ear just decided, no, I'm going to be very painful. Have I got all on the underside? I think I know what that one is. That one the side port side pipe. Right there. On the side plating. Yeah, I can pretty much guess what that one is. I'll come back to those. Let's get up top. And then work around the edges. Do ba lo do ba ya da do da ya la do ma do ya da da do I la da do ba de ya ma ba la de ya la 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 de do ba ya do ya ho ba lo la do la 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 lo da do da ya ha ya bo ha ha ya lo da yo ba la lo la la do do a de ya da do do la la da la do de di ya do la da do ba da do da da do de di ya la de yap ma na de do yap ma lo yap ba di ya da do de di la do da da la do me la da do do de do la da de la di do I take ba di yo o da de do da di de le ye da do da di le di ya do da di da la do da le di da la da do a de do da do ma di do di ya do sta da ya mo ya pa la la da di la da do bo ba lo yo di ya bo ya pa da do ba de da la do ya la da do bo la de le di yo ba da do wa yo go ya da di ya ma na la yo ha ya da ga go ma na la da yo da di ya do da ya pa da la de ya da da do ba da da di la la do do ba do di le di ya pa da da do da la da do I da do di le di. So we're just flying. Di do re di le di. Rightio. Let's get let's just get bulk of stuff done and just get back into fiddling for the rest. Up to 56%. I bet there'll be another message at the 60% mark. Ding! That's gone. Yeah, I can guess what's remain on this is on the underside of around this edge. Oh, message. The 60%. Can't wait to get back in the Falcon. These furry critters are a bit too friendly. Ando Calrissian. These what? Yeah, the Ewoks. Long story, just get yourself down here, bud, and I'll fill you in. Chewie wants to hear all about your run, too. There is a lot on top of, a lot of fiddly stuff on top here. Man. So much to clean up top here. Don't know which one's worse, cleaning on the underside or cleaning the top side. Yeah, this will probably looks like it might be a two-parter, this cleaning job. A lot of fiddly stuff up top. mouse pad keeps moving. Oh, itchy. Uh, 66%. Oh, almost falling off there. Rightio. 68. Yeah, I think the timer is on the recording is catching up to this. I think what I'm going to do is when I reach 70%, I am going to stop the recording and then start it again. Split this video up, this job up. to do the last 30% in the second part. The 70% mark, I'll stop the recording. And we'll continue from there. 70%! Right. I'm going to stop the recording now at like 46 minutes, so I'm going to stop it and then start it up again. Be right back.